Grandpa Richard smiled warmly across the Christmas table and asked if I was still living in the house he bought me. The loud clatter of my silver fork hitting the fine china shattered the festive cheer. I stared at him, my heart hammering furiously against my ribs. I told him that I had been renting a tiny room for 3 years and that I never got any house. The entire room went dead silent. He slowly turned to my parents, and for the very first time in my life, I saw pure, unadulterated terror in their eyes. My name is Sarah Jenkins. I am 27 years old, drowning in student debt from a medical billing degree and working 60 grueling hours a week just to keep my head above water. While my parents always paraded my sister Jessica around as their flawless golden child, I was the designated family disappointment. I was the one who had to figure it out alone, or so I thought. The heavy smell of roasted turkey and expensive wine suddenly made me sick to my stomach. Grandpa Richard had just returned to the United States after spending 5 years recovering from a severe stroke at a private clinic in Switzerland. As a self-made billionaire real estate mogul, he was the only person in this family who ever looked at me with genuine pride. Now, sitting at the head of the table, his joyful expression vanished into a sharp, dangerous frown. My father, David, practically choked on his wine. He scrambled out of his mahogany chair, his face flushed bright red. He tried to force a loud laugh, waving his hands as if dismissing a silly joke. He actually said Grandpa was just confused from his long flight and his heavy medications. My mother, Patricia, gripped her glass so tightly her knuckles turned white. She shot me a look so venomous it could have stripped paint from the walls, silently commanding me to shut my mouth and play along. Even my brother-in-law, Marcus, a flashy African-American architect who loved showing off his supposed self-made wealth, scoffed and muttered that I was always trying to ruin the holidays with my jealousy. My mother reached over and tried to grab my arm to stop me from speaking. For years, I would have shrunk down. I would have swallowed my words to keep the peace, but not tonight. I spent my days fighting over insurance claims at the hospital and my nights secretly studying for my CPA in forensic accounting. I knew what financial deception looked like. I pulled my arm away from my mother. I looked right past her frantic glare and directly into my grandfather's eyes. I told him exactly what my life had been like since he left. The freezing studio apartment, the thrift store winter coats, the relentless overtime shifts just to afford groceries. Grandpa Richard did not blink. The confusion on his face melted into absolute chilling fury. He violently swatted my father's hand away as David tried to grab his wheelchair, demanding to know exactly where his money went. The silence in the dining room was absolute and suffocating. It was the kind of silence that rings in your ears after a car crash. I stood there, looking at my grandfather Richard, whose kind wrinkled face had just hardened into a mask of complete bewilderment. He had spent the last 5 years in a private clinic in Switzerland recovering from a massive stroke. He had missed birthdays and holidays and the mundane details of our daily lives. He had trusted my parents to manage his affairs locally. He had trusted them to take care of me, and now sitting in his wheelchair at the head of a table covered in roasted turkey and expensive crystal glasses, he was looking at me like he did not recognize the reality we were living in. My father, David, was the first to react. His face drained of all color, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. The wineglass in his hand shook so violently that red wine sloshed over the rim and stained the pure white tablecloth. He let out a loud, forced laugh that sounded more like a bark of panic. He quickly stood up, pushing his heavy mahogany dining chair back so hard it screeched against the hardwood floor. He said Grandpa was just confused. He waved his hands in the air, acting as if my grandfather had just told a silly, senseless joke. He looked around the table with wide, desperate eyes, telling everyone that the long international flight and the heavy stroke medications were making Richard imagine things. My mother, Patricia, immediately joined the performance. She grabbed her own wineglass, her knuckles turning stark white from the pressure. She plastered on the fake, tight smile she always used when she needed to control a narrative. She leaned across the table and told Richard, in a sickeningly sweet voice, that he was simply exhausted. She said there was no house. She told him his memory was playing tricks on him because of his old age. She spoke to him as if he were a toddler throwing a tantrum. It was the exact same tone she used to use on me whenever I asked why my sister Jessica got new clothes while I wore thrift store hand-me-downs. I felt a cold wave of adrenaline wash over me. For 27 years, I had been the designated family disappointment. I had worked 60 grueling hours a week at the hospital, handling medical billing disputes just to barely afford my rent. I had eaten cheap ramen noodles in the dark while my parents bought Jessica a brand new car. I had always believed I was simply the child who was not worth the investment. But looking at the sheer terror vibrating in my parents' eyes, I suddenly realized that my entire life of poverty was not a lack of their generosity. It was an active cover-up. My father rushed over to my grandfather. He grabbed the rubber handles of the wheelchair with sweaty, trembling hands. He told Richard that it was time for him to go rest in the guest bedroom. He tried to physically pull the wheelchair away from the table. It was a violent, panicked movement disguised as caring for an elderly man. He wanted to remove the threat from the room before another word could be spoken. I did not let him. I pushed my own chair back and stood up straight. My legs felt like lead, but my voice came out with the strength I did not know I possessed. I looked directly at my father and commanded him to take his hands off my grandfather right this second. The entire table gasped. My mother slammed her hand flat against the table, making the silverware rattle. She shrieked at me to sit down and shut my mouth. She accused me of trying to ruin a beautiful family Christmas with my delusions. She said I was being dramatic and ungrateful, just like I always was. She looked at me with a hatred so pure and unfiltered, it made my breath catch in my throat. That was when Marcus decided to intervene. Marcus is my brother-in-law married to my supposedly perfect sister, Jessica. He's an African-American high-end residential architect who never misses an opportunity to remind everyone how wealthy and successful he is. He loves to brag about his self-made empire while wearing custom-tailored suits and a heavy gold Rolex that he constantly checks just so you notice it. He sat across from me swirling his expensive bourbon with a look of utter disgust on his face. Marcus sneered at me and told me I needed to seek psychiatric help. He laughed bitterly and said I was always trying to make myself the victim just because I was jealous of his and Jessica's success. He looked me up and down, taking in my inexpensive dress, and told me that my jealousy was a toxic disease. He said I was a broke medical billing clerk who could not stand the fact that my sister had built a beautiful, wealthy life. He demanded that I sit down and show some respect to the family that was generous enough to even invite me to dinner. Jessica sat next to him, nodding along in agreement. She looked at me like I was a piece of trash that had blown in through the front door. But Richard was not confused. He was old, and his body was frail from the stroke, but his mind was as sharp as a steel trap. He had built a billion-dollar real estate empire from nothing. He knew exactly what a liar looked like. Richard violently swatted my father's hand away from the wheelchair handles. The sharp smack of flesh against flesh echoed through the silent dining room. My father jumped back, completely stunned by the force of the blow. Richard glared up at his son with eyes full of absolute venom. He ordered David to step back and not to touch him ever again. His voice was raspy, but it carried the unquestionable authority of a man who commanded boardrooms for 40 years. Richard reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. His hands trembled slightly from the residual nerve damage, but his eyes were sharp and furious. He pulled out his smartphone. He placed it firmly on the white tablecloth right next to a platter of cranberry sauce. He did not look at my mother. He did not look at my father. He kept his furious gaze locked onto Marcus, who had suddenly gone very quiet. With shaking fingers, Richard navigated to his contacts and pressed a number. He pressed the speakerphone button so the audio would broadcast clearly to every single person sitting in that room. The rhythmic, ringing tone pulsed through the air. Each ring felt like a hammer striking an anvil. My mother began to hyperventilate. She reached her hands out toward the center of the table, begging Richard to hang up. She promised him that they could talk about this privately in the morning. She swore that there was just a massive misunderstanding with the paperwork and that she could explain everything if he would just listen to her. Richard ignored her completely. He sat completely rigid, staring straight ahead. The call connected. A crisp, professional voice came through the speaker. It was William Thorne, the senior private wealth manager who handled Richard's massive trust accounts. William politely greeted my grandfather, asking how his first Christmas back in the United States was going. Richard did not exchange pleasantries. He told William that he was sitting at the dinner table with his family and needed immediate verbal confirmation of a real estate transaction executed exactly 36 months ago. He asked William to look up the property profile for the estate located in the gated community of Oakwood Hills. I watched my father physically sway on his feet. He grabbed the back of an empty chair to keep himself from collapsing. Patricia covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with unadulterated panic. Marcus stopped swirling his bourbon. He set his glass down very slowly. Jessica looked back and forth between her husband and my parents, a sudden look of confusion breaking through her smug facade. William asked for a brief moment while he pulled up the secure files. The silence while we waited was agonizing. The only sound in the room was the heavy, ragged breathing of my parents. I stood there, feeling a bizarre mixture of profound validation and terrifying realization. I had spent 3 years agonizing over utility bills and crying in my car because I could not afford new tires. All that time, my grandfather had provided for me. He had bought me a home. He had given me security. And the people who were supposed to love and protect me had stolen it. William's voice returned over the speaker, clear and undeniable. He stated that the property at Oakwood Hills was purchased in full with a cash wire transfer of exactly $1.5 million. He confirmed that the transaction bypassed all mortgage contingencies and was executed flawlessly according to Richard's direct orders. Richard leaned closer to the phone. He asked William to confirm exactly whose name was placed on the legal deed of the house at the time of closing. William did not hesitate. He stated that the deed was transferred entirely and exclusively into the name of Sarah Jenkins. He confirmed that I was the sole legal owner of the $1.5 million property, free and clear of any initial liens or encumbrances. He added that the documents were finalized, signed and processed 3 years ago, just before Richard suffered his major medical emergency. Richard thanked William and ended the call. The screen went black. The truth was now sitting in the center of the table, undeniable and absolute. The dinner instantly imploded. The carefully constructed illusion of my family shattered into a million jagged pieces. Jessica let out a piercing, dramatic scream. She pushed her chair back so violently it crashed to the floor. She shrieked that I was destroying the family on purpose. She yelled that I was an ungrateful monster who was trying to ruin her perfect Christmas. She grabbed her linen napkin and threw it directly into her half-eaten plate of food, sending gravy splattering across the pristine white cloth. Marcus stood up, his face a mask of furious indignation. He pointed a finger at me and shouted that this entire family was insane. He told Jessica they were leaving immediately because he refused to spend another minute in a house full of toxic, dramatic garbage. He grabbed Jessica by the arm, dragging her toward the front hallway. Jessica sobbed loudly, acting as if she were the ultimate victim of a tragedy she did not even fully comprehend yet. They grabbed their coats from the rack. Marcus yelled one final insult, calling me a miserable failure, before pulling the heavy wooden front door open and slamming it shut behind them. The house shook from the force of the slam. Richard watched them leave with a look of profound disgust. He slowly turned his head to look at my father, who was now sweating profusely and staring at the floor. Richard told David that he was entirely repulsed by the sight of him. His voice was low, but it carried a lethal edge. He said he had trusted his own son to manage his affairs while he was fighting for his life in a hospital bed across the world. He said he had trusted him to take care of his granddaughter. David tried to speak. He stammered and choked on his words, claiming that they had only made financial adjustments because they thought they knew what was best for the family business. He tried to say that I was not mature enough to handle such a massive asset. Richard silenced him with a single raise of his hand. He told David to save his pathetic, cowardly lies for the federal authorities. He ordered my father to step entirely away from his wheelchair and instructed him never to approach him again. Richard pulled out his phone one more time and dialed his private security driver, who was waiting outside in a black SUV. He demanded that the driver come into the house immediately and extract him from this den of thieves. He refused to spend a single second longer under the same roof as my parents. 2 massive men in dark suits entered the dining room moments later. They did not ask questions. They smoothly and efficiently took control of Richard's wheelchair. My mother fell to her knees, weeping hysterically. She reached out and tried to grab the sleeve of Richard's suit, begging him not to walk away from his own blood. She sobbed that they could fix this and make it right. Richard looked down at her with absolutely zero pity. He told her that she was a parasite. He told her that she had destroyed her own family for the sake of greed and that he would personally ensure she paid for every single thing she had stolen from me. The security team wheeled my grandfather out of the dining room and down the front hallway. The front door opened and closed. The hum of the heavy SUV engine faded into the cold winter night. The house went dead quiet. I was left standing in the dining room, surrounded by cold foods, spilled wine, and the wreckage of my entire life. I looked at the two people who brought me into this world. I looked at the mother who had always told me I was not working hard enough to succeed. I looked at the father who had watched me struggle to pay for basic necessities while knowing he was hiding a massive fortune that belonged to me. My father stopped staring at the floor. His posture changed. The cowardly, stammering man who had just cowered before his billionaire father vanished. He slowly straightened his back and wiped the sweat from his forehead. He turned and walked down the hallway toward the front entrance. I watched him reach out and grab the heavy brass deadbolt on the front door. He turned it slowly. The heavy metallic click of the lock sliding into place echoed down the hallway like a gunshot. He walked back into the dining room, blocking my only clear path to the exit. My mother stopped her hysterical sobbing. She slowly stood up from the floor, dusting off her knees. The tears vanished from her face, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. The masks were completely gone now. There was no more gaslighting. There was no more pretending. They had stolen a $1.5 million estate from me. They had forged legal documents to cover it up. They knew that I had just discovered a felony crime that could put them both in federal prison for the rest of their lives. And they knew that I was the only person standing between them and total financial ruin. My mother crossed her arms over her chest and looked at me with a frighteningly calm expression. She told me that I was not leaving this house until we reached an understanding. I stood in the center of the room, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I was completely trapped inside a locked house with the two people who had just realized I possessed the power to destroy them. I stood there in the dining room with my heart hammering against my ribs as my father blocked the front door. The heavy brass deadbolt had just clicked into place loudly. My mother dropped her weeping victim act entirely. Her face transformed into a mask of cold and furious calculation. I realized in a fraction of a second that I could not stay in that house. I grabbed my heavy winter coat from the back of the dining chair and shoved past my mother. She stumbled backward with a gasp of shock that I had actually used physical force against her. I did not look back. I bolted down the hallway. My father tried to step in front of the locked door to trap me inside, but I threw my entire body weight against his shoulder. He lost his balance just enough for me to reach the deadbolt, twist it, and throw the heavy wooden door open. The freezing December air hit my face like a physical blow. I scrambled down the concrete steps of their pristine suburban home while my boots slipped dangerously on the icy walkway. I just needed to get to my car. I needed to get inside my beat-up 10-year-old sedan and lock the doors. As I reached the driveway with the gravel crunching loudly under my boots, I heard the front door slam open behind me. Heavy footsteps pounded down the concrete steps. Before I could even pull my car keys from my pocket, a hand grabbed the back of my coat and violently yanked me backward. I spun around, losing my footing on the ice, and came face to face with my parents. The driveway security lights flickered on, casting harsh cold shadows across their faces. There was no more pretending. The loving and concerned parents they played for the rest of the world were completely gone. Patricia stood there, panting with her eyes wide and manic. David moved quickly to block my car door, standing between me and my only escape route. Then my mother stepped forward and slapped me across the face. The sharp crack of her hand against my frozen cheek echoed loudly in the quiet suburban neighborhood. The stinging pain was immediate and intense, radiating through my jaw and down my neck. I stumbled back against the icy metal of my car door, holding my face in pure shock. I had endured years of emotional neglect and verbal abuse, but she had never actually struck me. Not until tonight. Not until the money was on the line. Patricia leaned in close. Her voice was no longer hysterical or weeping. It was a vicious and venomous whisper. She told me that I had absolutely no right to act like a victim. She said the $1.5 million house Grandpa Richard bought was nothing more than compensation. She stared right into my eyes and said it was her rightful compensation for raising a mediocre and disappointing daughter. She spat the words at me, saying that while they had poured their hearts into raising me, I had amounted to nothing but a low-level hospital clerk. She said the house was legally mine on paper, but morally, it belonged to the family. She claimed they fully deserved that massive asset for having to put up with my constant failures and my lack of ambition. She did not stop there. She pointed a manicured finger at my chest and justified every single lie they had told. She said Jessica and Marcus desperately needed that capital. She explained that Marcus was building a high-end residential architecture firm from the ground up and that required massive financial backing to impress his wealthy clients. She said Jessica was a visionary who deserved to live the luxurious lifestyle she was destined for. My mother actually looked me in the eye and told me that my life was stagnant, so it was only fair that my hidden assets were repurposed to fund Marcus and Jessica's growing empire. She said they were taking the wealth I was wasting and putting it in the hands of people who actually mattered in this world. The sheer audacity of her confession left me completely paralyzed. They had stolen a massive real estate fortune, and they genuinely believed they were the victims of my existence. My father finally spoke. He did not yell. He did not raise his voice in anger. He spoke with the terrifying and calculated calm of a man cornering a wounded animal. He took a step closer, making his large frame trap me against the cold car door. He told me that if I ever tried to contact Grandpa Richard again, or if I ever tried to claim that house, or involve the police, he would destroy the tiny, pathetic life I had managed to build. He reminded me that I worked at the city hospital, managing billing and having access to sensitive medical areas. He looked me dead in the eye and said he would personally call the hospital administration and the local police department. He said he would anonymously report that I had been stealing high-grade patient narcotics and selling them on the street. The absolute horror of his blackmail washed over me, freezing the blood in my veins. A narcotics charge would not just get me fired from the hospital, it would mean a police investigation and permanent prison time. It would instantly strip away my entire future and permanently bar me from ever sitting for my certified public accountant exams. My own father was standing in his suburban driveway, under the twinkling Christmas lights, casually threatening to frame me for a federal crime just to protect the millions he had stolen from me. He told me that the police would easily believe a concerned and heartbroken father trying to get his troubled, addicted daughter some help. He said no one in the world would ever believe a mediocre billing clerk over her respectable and grieving parents. Pure survival instinct took over my body. I realized I was no longer talking to my family. I was talking to two desperate criminals who were fully willing to destroy my life to save themselves from prison. I shoved my father backward with every ounce of strength I had left in my body. The sudden aggressive movement caught him completely off guard. He slipped on a patch of black ice and stumbled backward into the snowbank. I ripped the car door open, threw myself into the driver's seat, and slammed the power lock button just as my mother lunged for the handle. I jammed the key into the ignition. The old engine sputtered, coughed, and finally roared to life. My mother was pounding her fists against the driver's side window, screaming threatening words I could not hear over the sound of the struggling engine. I threw the car into reverse. The tires spun on the ice for a terrifying second before finally catching traction. I peeled out of the driveway with the back end of my car fishtailing wildly into the dark street. I did not look back in the rearview mirror. I just pressed the gas pedal down to the floor and drove blindly into the freezing night. I drove aimlessly for over an hour, with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. My face still throbbed from where my mother had struck me, but the physical pain was absolutely nothing compared to the shock vibrating through my entire body. I eventually made it back to my rundown apartment building. I ran up the 2 flights of stairs and locked myself inside my tiny freezing rented room. I collapsed onto my cheap mattress and pulled my knees tightly to my chest. I was shaking uncontrollably in the dark. I had no money to my name. I had no power or influence. I had a father who was ready to frame me for a felony drug charge, and a mother who viewed my existence as a burden she was entitled to be heavily compensated for. I felt entirely and utterly alone in the world. I stared at the peeling paint on my bedroom ceiling, wondering how I was going to survive the week without losing my freedom. Then the heavy silence of my dark room was broken by the sharp, sudden ringing of my cell phone on the nightstand. I flinched violently, terrified it was my father calling to follow through on his horrific threats. I slowly reached over and picked up the glowing phone. The caller identification displayed an unknown local number. I hesitated for a long moment, holding my breath before pressing the answer button and bringing the phone to my ear. I did not say a single word. I just sat there and listened. A familiar, raspy voice came through the speaker. It was Grandpa Richard. He sounded exhausted but incredibly focused. He told me he had managed to slip away from the private security detail his wealth manager had hired to escort him. He said he was currently sitting alone in a booth at a 24-hour diner on the edge of town. He told me to get in my car and meet him there immediately. He said it was time to stop running and find out exactly what they had done. The heater in my beat-up sedan was completely broken. I shivered violently as I drove through the dark and empty streets. The icy December rain lashed against my windshield, blurring the neon signs of the closed storefronts along the highway. My heart was still hammering against my ribs from the confrontation in the driveway. My own mother had slapped me across the face. My father had threatened to frame me for a federal drug crime just to protect the money he had stolen. They were absolute monsters, hiding behind perfect suburban smiles. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned stark white, forcing myself to focus entirely on the road ahead. I finally pulled into the empty parking lot of a 24-hour diner located on the industrial edge of town. The glowing red neon sign buzzed loudly in the freezing night air, casting a harsh crimson light across the wet pavement. I parked under a flickering street lamp and took a deep, ragged breath to steady my shaking hands. I pushed open the heavy glass door of the diner, and a wave of artificial heat washed over me. The smell of stale coffee and fried food hit my senses immediately. The place was completely deserted except for a tired waitress wiping down the front counter and one solitary figure sitting in the very back corner booth. Grandpa Richard looked incredibly fragile sitting on the cracked vinyl bench. He was wrapped tightly in a heavy dark wool overcoat, but his posture was completely rigid. The physical toll of the stroke was evident in the slight droop of his shoulder, but his eyes burned with an intensity I had never seen before. I walked over quietly and slid into the booth across from him. The waitress walked over without saying a word and placed 2 heavy ceramic mugs of black coffee on the laminated table before turning and walking away. We were completely alone in the quiet diner. Richard did not say hello. He did not ask if I was okay or if I was hurt. He simply reached down into his thick leather briefcase and pulled out a massive, heavy manila folder. He dropped it directly in the center of the table. The dull thud of the paper hitting the wood sounded incredibly loud in the empty room. He looked me dead in the eye and told me that his private wealth manager had pulled every single legal document connected to the estate. He said he had an emergency courier deliver the physical copies directly to his hotel room while I was driving over. He told me to open the folder. He warned me that what I was about to see was going to make me physically sick. I stared at the thick manila folder for a long, agonizing moment. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely grab the edge of the heavy paper cover. I flipped it open. Inside was an absolute mountain of legal paperwork, bank statements, and property records. For a normal medical billing clerk, this would look like an overwhelming maze of confusing legalese and meaningless numbers. But I was not just a clerk. I had spent the last 3 years sacrificing sleep and a social life to secretly study for my certified public accountant license, specializing heavily in forensic accounting. I knew exactly how to track hidden assets. I knew exactly how financial predators manipulated complex systems to hide their crimes. I took a deep, trembling breath, pushing my visceral fear aside, and let my strict professional training take over. I pulled the heavy stack of documents toward me and began to read. I started with the original property deed. Just as the wealth manager had confirmed, the massive house in Oakwood Hills was purchased entirely in cash, and the deed was cleanly registered exclusively in my name. The initial transfer was completely legitimate and flawless, but as I flipped to the next set of pages, the polished facade of the transaction began to violently crumble. I stared at a document labeled General Durable Power of Attorney. It was dated just 2 weeks after the house was officially purchased. My heart completely stopped beating as I read the fine print printed across the page. The document explicitly granted my father, David Jenkins, total unchecked legal authority over all my financial decisions, real estate holdings, and private bank accounts. I looked down at the signature line at the bottom of the page. There was my name signed in dark blue ink, but it was absolutely not my handwriting. The loops of the cursive letters were slightly too rigid, and the pen pressure was completely wrong. It was a flawless, terrifying forgery. My parents had faked my signature and clearly paid off a corrupt local notary public to stamp it into the official county legal record. They had essentially stripped away my entire financial autonomy and handed themselves the master keys to my identity without me ever knowing a single thing about it. The sheer audacity of the crime made my stomach churn with nausea. But the absolute horror did not stop there. The forged power of attorney was merely the lockpick they used to open the vault. I aggressively shuffled through the stack of papers, pulling out a thick bundle of heavily redacted bank statements from a major national mortgage lender. I recognized the specific accounting formatting immediately from my advanced forensic case studies. It was a home equity line of credit. I felt the breath leave my lungs. A home equity line of credit is a revolving loan that allows a homeowner to borrow massive amounts of cash using the raw equity of their house as collateral. Because the Oakwood Hills estate was purchased entirely in cash for $1.5 million, it possessed a massive amount of untapped equity. I traced my shaking index finger down the columns of printed numbers. My breathing became incredibly shallow and fast. My parents had used the forged power of attorney to apply for a massive loan against my property. Because they used my completely clean financial history and the massive value of the unencumbered house, the bank had approved the massive loan almost instantly. I stared in absolute horror at the withdrawal column. $50,000 withdrawn in May, $100,000 withdrawn in August, $200,000 withdrawn right before the holidays. They had been treating my home like their own personal, unlimited cash machine. I flipped frantically to the final summary page of the bank statement. The total outstanding balance on the loan was precisely $800,000. I felt all the blood rush entirely out of my face. The dimly lit diner suddenly spun around me. I gripped the hard plastic edge of the laminated table with both hands, just to keep myself from passing out. I was legally responsible for $800,000 in raw debt. My parents had maliciously drained the equity out of the house, leaving me holding a massive financial bomb that was ready to detonate at any moment. While I was skipping meals to save a few dollars and freezing in a cheap rented apartment because I could not afford heating, my parents had been actively annihilating my financial future. I realized with a sickening clarity that my parents must have been making the bare minimum monthly interest payments on the loan just to keep the bank from defaulting and alerting me to the fraud. If the bank ever called the loan due or if the interest rates ballooned, I would be forced into catastrophic public bankruptcy. My immaculate credit score, which I had worked so incredibly hard to build and protect, was secretly a ticking time bomb. I looked up at Grandpa Richard. Hot tears of absolute panic and burning rage were streaming down my face. I told him that I was nearly $1 million in debt. I told him that my own flesh and blood had completely ruined my life. Richard slammed his fist against the table with a terrifying force. The heavy ceramic coffee mugs rattled violently, spilling dark liquid onto the table. His face was twisted in an expression of pure lethal rage. He pulled his smartphone out of his thick wool coat pocket and quickly unlocked the screen. He told me he was calling the chief of police right this very second. He said he was going to have David and Patricia dragged out of their comfortable beds and thrown into a federal holding cell before the sun even came up. He wanted them to burn for the absolute devastation they had caused. He pressed his finger against the keypad, ready to dial the emergency number. I reached across the table and grabbed his wrist with both hands. I clamped my hands down hard over his phone, physically stopping him from making the call. Richard stared at me in complete shock. He demanded to know exactly what I was doing and why I would ever try to protect the monsters who had just tried to completely destroy me. I looked at him directly in the eyes. My tears suddenly dried up as a cold, calculated clarity washed over my mind. The terrified daughter sitting at the table vanished completely. The forensic accountant took over. I told him we could not call the police right now. I explained my intense forensic accounting training to him for the very first time, detailing the hundreds of hours I had spent studying financial fraud. I told him that white-collar criminals like my parents always have an escape plan built in. If we sent the local police to their door tonight, David and Patricia would instantly play the role of the victims. They would claim it was a terrible family misunderstanding about financial management. They would hire vicious elite defense attorneys to tie the case up in court for a decade while I drowned in legal fees I could never possibly afford. But more importantly, I pointed directly to the stack of bank statements. I told Richard that $800,000 does not just sit idly in a standard checking account. My parents did not have that kind of liquid cash sitting around their suburban house. The money was actively moving. It was being carefully placed, layered, integrated, and laundered. I explained that if we wanted to destroy them completely and ensure they spent the rest of their lives behind bars, we had to find out exactly where every single dollar of that money went. I told my grandfather that I was going to follow the wire transfers right to their doorstep. I told him I was going to build an airtight federal case against them from the shadows. To put them away for good, I needed to track the stolen funds because the money definitely did not stay with my parents. It was laundered out to someone else. The next 48 hours blurred into a frantic, desperate race against time. We left the diner and drove straight to Grandpa Richard's luxury hotel suite in downtown Seattle. By the time the sun started to rise over the city skyline, the massive living area had been completely transformed into a financial war room. Richard's private legal team arrived at 6 in the morning, carrying briefcases full of secure laptops and portable scanners. I did not sleep. I could not even fathom the concept of resting. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother's furious face in the driveway. I felt the stinging slap across my cheek. I heard my father threatening to frame me for a federal drug crime just to protect his own greed. The sheer adrenaline and burning need for justice kept my heart hammering against my ribs and my mind razor sharp. I sat at the center of the massive mahogany dining table, surrounded by mountains of printed bank statements, loan applications, and property records. I was no longer the exhausted medical billing clerk who cowered in the shadows of her family. I was a certified public accountant specializing in forensic financial investigations, and I was about to dissect my own family's financial crimes with surgical precision. The first layer of the deception was incredibly sophisticated, but it was not bulletproof. My parents had used the forged power of attorney to open the $800,000 home equity line of credit, but they knew they could not just transfer that massive amount of cash directly into their personal checking accounts. That would trigger immediate red flags with the Internal Revenue Service. Instead, they had created a complex web of shell companies and blind trusts to wash the money clean. But they underestimated my training. For the next 12 hours, I sat glued to my laptop, tracking routing numbers and tracing wire transfers across multiple state lines. I barely spoke. I just drank black coffee and let my eyes fly across the spreadsheets looking for the hidden patterns that white-collar criminals always leave behind. It started with a wire transfer of $150,000 executed just 3 days after the fraudulent credit line was opened. I tracked the routing number to a newly formed limited liability company registered in Delaware. The company was named Pinnacle Design Group. My breath hitched in my throat as the realization slammed into me. Pinnacle Design Group was the parent company of Marcus's high-end residential architecture firm. I remembered the lavish grand opening party he threw 2 years ago. I remembered how he stood on a rented stage wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit holding a glass of expensive champagne. He had proudly proclaimed to a room full of wealthy clients that he was a self-made visionary who built his empire from the ground up through nothing but hard work and relentless hustle. He loved to tell the story of how he bootstrapped his firm and overcame the odds. It was all an absolute lie. Marcus was not a self-made genius. He was a fraud. His entire business was built on a foundation of felony wire fraud and stolen equity. He had used my name, my perfect credit score, and my stolen property to fund his arrogant fantasies. Every single drafting table in his downtown office, every expensive computer, and every piece of custom furniture was paid for with my financial ruin. The deeper I dug into the records, the more nauseating the discoveries became. It was as if I was watching a documentary of my own exploitation playing out in cold, hard numbers. I found a wire transfer for $92,000 authorized directly by my father. The funds were sent to a luxury auto dealership. My mind flashed back to the previous Christmas when Jessica and Marcus had proudly pulled into my parents' driveway in matching jet black Mercedes SUVs. Jessica had tossed her keys on the kitchen counter, laughing and bragging about how her incredible husband had surprised her with the ultimate luxury vehicle. She had looked at my beat-up 10-year-old sedan parked on the street and actually told me that if I worked a little harder, I might be able to afford something nice one day too. While I was rationing my groceries and agonizing over a $50 heating bill, my sister was driving around in a $90,000 luxury vehicle funded entirely by my stolen equity. The absolute sheer audacity of their entitlement made my hands shake so violently, I had to step away from the keyboard and press my palms against my face. But the betrayal did not stop at cars and businesses. I scrolled through months of continuous withdrawals. $10,000 here, $15,000 there. The money was being funneled into a joint account controlled by Jessica and Marcus to fund a lifestyle of extreme, reckless luxury. I pulled up Jessica's public social media profile on my phone and cross-referenced her uploaded photos with the exact dates of the bank withdrawals. The correlation was terrifyingly precise. In August, there was a withdrawal of $45,000. 3 days later, Jessica posted a continuous stream of photos from a first-class trip to Dubai. I stared at the images of her and Marcus posing in a luxury desert resort, drinking expensive cocktails and wearing designer clothes. In the caption, she had written about how blessed she was to live such an abundant life with her hard-working husband. I matched a $12,000 withdrawal in November to a series of photos showing a massive shopping spree in Paris. There were pictures of designer handbags, expensive shoes, and fine jewelry. Every single smile in those photos, every flex of their wealth, every arrogant display of their success was a direct theft from my future. They had turned my identity into an unlimited credit card to finance a life they absolutely did not earn. By the 36-hour mark, the legal team and I had successfully mapped out exactly where over $600,000 had gone. We had the routing numbers, the destination accounts, and the physical receipts. But there was still a massive missing piece to the puzzle. Almost $200,000 had been slowly drained over the past 3 years in steady, consistent monthly increments. It did not match the pattern of their flashy vacations or business expenses. It looked like maintenance. It looked like somebody was paying massive carrying costs. I rubbed my burning eyes and pulled up the detailed transaction logs from the primary shell account. I started tracing the exact destinations of those steady monthly payments. My heart dropped into my stomach. The payments were going to a luxury landscaping company, a high-end pool maintenance service, a premium home security firm, and the Oakwood Hills Homeowner Association. I cross-referenced the billing addresses on every single one of those invoices. They all pointed to the exact same location, the $1.5 million estate that Grandpa Richard had purchased in my name, the house I had never even stepped foot inside. A cold, terrifying realization washed over my entire body. I looked across the hotel suite at Richard, who was sitting in an armchair reviewing a legal brief. I told him I finally figured out where the rest of the money was going. My voice was barely more than a hollow whisper. I explained that my parents were using the stolen loan money to pay the property taxes, the utility bills, and the massive upkeep costs for the Oakwood Hills estate. But they were not paying those bills to keep the house empty. The utility usage was incredibly high. The water bills showed massive consumption. The security system was actively monitored daily. Someone was living in my house. I quickly logged into a public records database and pulled the current voter registration and mailing address history for Marcus and Jessica. The results populated on my screen in a matter of seconds. I felt the air completely leave my lungs. Jessica and Marcus had changed their official permanent residence 2.5 years ago. The address listed on their driver licenses and their business filings was the Oakwood Hills estate. They were not just stealing my money, they were actively physically occupying the mansion that belonged to me. My sister and her fraudulent husband were waking up every morning in my house, cooking in my kitchen, and sleeping in my bedroom while pretending it was all the result of their own incredible success. The sickening reality of the situation hit me like a physical blow. When my mother slapped me in the driveway and screamed that the house was compensation, she did not just mean the financial value. She meant they had literally gifted my stolen property to the golden child to live in. The lead attorney of Richard's private legal team, a sharp, silver-haired woman named Catherine, walked over to the table and looked at the screen. She reviewed the utility bills and the registration records with a critical eye. She told me that the paper trail we had uncovered was incredibly strong, But if we wanted to guarantee that the Federal Bureau of Investigation would take the case and execute immediate arrests, we needed something completely undeniable. She explained that white-collar defense attorneys are incredibly skilled at creating reasonable doubt. Marcus could potentially claim that the funds were a legitimate business loan from my parents and that he had no idea the money was stolen. He could claim that he was merely renting the house from my parents under a verbal agreement and had no knowledge of the forged deed or the fraudulent credit line. Catherine looked at me seriously and said that to lock in the conspiracy charges to prove that Marcus and Jessica were active, willing participants in the fraud, we needed absolute physical proof of their current occupation of the property. We needed high-resolution photographic evidence showing them treating the estate as their own personal property. We needed pictures of their cars in the driveway, their belongings inside the gates, and their physical presence on the ground. We needed to show the federal authorities that this was an active, ongoing criminal conspiracy and not just a paperwork error. I sat back in my chair and looked out the massive windows of the hotel suite at the dark gray Seattle sky. My exhaustion vanished, replaced by a cold, burning determination. I had spent my entire life being treated like a ghost in my own family. I had allowed them to minimize me, to mock me, and to steal from me because I thought I had no power. But looking at the mountain of evidence spread across the mahogany table, I realized I held their entire future in the palm of my hands. They had built a beautiful glass castle entirely out of my stolen equity, and I was going to be the one to shatter it. I stood up from the table and grabbed my car keys. Richard asked me exactly what I was planning to do. I looked at my grandfather and told him that I was going to get the physical proof we needed. I was going to drive to the Oakwood Hills estate right now. I was going to walk up to the front door of the mansion that legally belonged to me, and I was going to look the thieves right in the eyes. I knew it was incredibly dangerous. I knew Marcus was arrogant, aggressive, and deeply protective of his false image. But I did not care. I needed to see the stolen house for myself, and I needed the photographic evidence to completely destroy them. The time for hiding was over. The time for justice had begun. The drive from downtown Seattle to the gated community of Oakwood Hills took exactly 42 minutes, but it felt like an absolute lifetime. The freezing rain had finally stopped, leaving the suburban streets slick and shining under the amber glow of the streetlights. I gripped the steering wheel of my beat-up 10-year-old sedan so tightly that my fingers cramped and ached. My mind was racing through the catastrophic financial revelations of the past 12 hours. My parents had forged my signature. They had taken out an $800,000 line of credit in my name. They had funneled my stolen equity directly into my sister Jessica and her husband Marcus to fund a life of extreme luxury. And now I was driving to the $1.5 million estate that legally belonged to me to confront the thieves who were currently sleeping inside it. I pulled up to the massive wrought iron security gates that guarded the entrance to Oakwood Hills. The community was a fortress of extreme wealth, entirely isolated from the struggles of the normal world. A uniformed security guard stepped out of the warmly lit guardhouse and approached my driver's side window. He shined a bright tactical flashlight directly into my eyes and then slowly panned the beam down the side of my rusted, dented sedan. His expression immediately hardened into a mask of pure suspicion. He told me that this was private property and that all uninvited vehicles needed to turn around immediately. I did not argue with him. I simply reached into the passenger seat, picked up the heavy manila folder Grandpa Richard had given me, and pulled out the original property deed along with my state-issued driver license. I held the documents out the window. I told the guard to look at the name on the legal deed and then look at the name on my identification card. The guard frowned, taking the papers from my hand. He shined his flashlight onto the heavy parchment illuminating the Golden County seal and the precise legal description of the massive estate. I watched his eyes dart back and forth between my face, my cheap clothes, my terrible car, and the official legal document proving I was the sole owner of one of the most expensive properties in the entire neighborhood. The arrogant suspicion melted completely off his face, replaced by profound confusion. He handed the documents back to me with a trembling hand and apologized for the delay. He stepped back into his booth and pressed a button. The massive iron gates slowly swung open with a heavy mechanical hum, granting me access to the stolen life my family had built. I drove slowly through the winding manicured streets of the neighborhood. Every single lawn was perfectly landscaped. Every driveway held imported luxury vehicles, and every massive house was illuminated by expensive architectural lighting. The sheer magnitude of the wealth surrounding me was nauseating, knowing that my own credit score had been secretly annihilated to buy my family a ticket into this exclusive world. I followed the navigation on my phone until I reached the address listed on the deed. I put my car in park and just stared through the windshield. The house was absolutely breathtaking. It was a massive modern marvel of glass and dark mahogany wood surrounded by perfectly manicured hedges and a sweeping circular driveway. Parked right in front of the grand entryway were the two matching jet black Mercedes SUVs that Jessica and Marcus loved to show off at family gatherings. The raw fury bubbling inside my chest threatened to completely consume me. While I was taking grueling night classes and shivering in a tiny rented room because I could not afford to turn on the heat, my sister and her husband were living in a literal mansion that I technically owned. Every single brick of that house, every blade of grass, every drop of gas in those luxury cars was paid for with my stolen future. I turned off the engine and stepped out into the freezing night air. I walked up the long sweeping stone pathway toward the massive front door. My boots echoed loudly in the quiet upscale neighborhood. I reached the front porch and pressed the glowing doorbell. Deep inside the house, I could hear the faint sound of a high-end digital chime ringing through the massive halls. I stood there shivering in my cheap winter coat, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. A few moments later, the heavy mahogany door swung open. Marcus stood in the threshold. My brother-in-law was an African-American residential architect who had always treated me like an insignificant peasant. He stood there, looking like a caricature of extreme wealth. He was wearing a dark silk robe tied loosely at the waist and holding a heavy crystal glass filled with expensive amber scotch. A massive solid gold Rolex gleamed on his wrist, catching the warm light spilling out from the grand foyer behind him. When he saw me standing on the porch, his expression shifted from casual annoyance to complete and utter shock. He stared at me for a long second before his shock warped into a cruel, arrogant smirk. He took a slow sip of his scotch, letting the ice clink loudly against the crystal glass. He asked me what on earth I was doing standing on his front porch in the middle of the night. He looked me up and down, taking in my worn-out shoes and my cheap coat. He laughed a dry, mocking sound and asked how I even managed to get my terrible junk car past the security gate without being arrested for vagrancy. I did not shrink back. The scared 13-year-old girl they had thrown away was entirely gone. I looked him dead in the eye and told him that he was living in a house that legally belonged to me. I told him I knew everything. I told him about the forged power of attorney, the stolen $800,000 credit line, and the fraudulent wire transfers that funded his entire fake architectural empire. I demanded that he pack his bags and get out of my property immediately. Marcus threw his head back and laughed loudly. It was not a nervous laugh. It was a deep, booming laugh of pure, malicious entitlement. He leaned his tall frame against the heavy doorframe, crossing his arms over his chest. He told me that I was completely delusional. He completely admitted that he and Jessica were living there, but he said the house belonged to them now. Them! He sneered at me and proudly declared that my mother, Patricia, had legally transferred the deed of the house into an anonymous holding company that he entirely controlled. My heart hammered furiously against my ribs. I told him that Patricia had absolutely no legal right to transfer a single asset because the power of attorney was a massive felony forgery. Marcus just smiled, taking another slow sip of his expensive scotch. He shook his head and spoke to me with a sickly sweet, patronizing tone. He told me that Patricia had documented proof that I was mentally unfit to manage my own life. He claimed my parents had gathered an extensive file showing that my grueling work hours and my social isolation were actually symptoms of a severe psychiatric breakdown. He said Patricia stepped in as a loving mother to protect my assets from my own insane behavior. He looked at me with pure venom and said the house was simply their reward for dealing with a crazy, broke, and completely ungrateful daughter. He told me that nobody in this world would ever believe a miserable hospital clerk over a highly successful luxury architect and his perfectly respectable suburban in-laws. He taunted my poverty directly to my face. He pointed to the massive crystal chandelier sparkling in the grand foyer behind him and asked if I genuinely believed a miserable peasant like me deserved to live in a house like this. He said Jessica needed the space to host high-end clients, and that my stolen money was finally being put to good use by people who actually mattered in modern society. He told me to crawl back to my pathetic rented room and leave the wealthy people alone. The absolute sheer audacity of his confession ignited a blazing fire in my blood. He knew the money was stolen. He knew the documents were forged. He was a fully active participant in the criminal conspiracy to destroy my life, and he was proudly bragging about it to my face. I took a deliberate step forward, moving to cross the threshold into the grand foyer of my own stolen home. I told him I was coming inside to take pictures of the property for the federal investigators. The second my boot touched the imported marble floor of the entryway, Marcus's arrogant smirk vanished completely. His eyes widened with sudden aggressive rage. He dropped his crystal glass of scotch onto the floor, where it shattered into 100 jagged pieces. He lunged forward and slammed both of his large hands directly into my chest. The physical force of his violent shove lifted me off my feet and threw me backward. I stumbled hard across the stone porch, my arms flailing wildly as I tried to catch my balance. I hit the stone pillar near the steps, scraping my elbow sharply against the rough masonry. Marcus stood in the doorway, his chest heaving with furious anger. He pulled his smartphone from the pocket of his silk robe and immediately dialed the community security booth. He did not break eye contact with me as he raised the phone to his ear. The second the guard answered, Marcus instantly transformed his voice. The arrogant, aggressive architect vanished and was instantly replaced by the panicked voice of a terrified homeowner. He yelled into the phone that a deranged and violent woman was trespassing on his property and harassing his family. He claimed I was highly unstable and demanded that security respond immediately before he was forced to defend himself. I stood there on the cold stone porch, completely humiliated, but fiercely analyzing the situation. My instinct was to scream, to fight back, to force my way into the house that legally belonged to me. But the forensic accountant inside my mind screamed at me to stop. I knew exactly what Marcus was trying to do. He wanted me to act crazy. He wanted me to scream and fight and get arrested by the police. If I was charged with trespassing or assault on his property, it would instantly legitimize my mother's false claims about my mental instability. A police record would permanently destroy my chances of ever passing the board requirements for my certified public accountant license. It would ruin my credibility with the federal investigators and give my parents the exact ammunition they needed to win. I could hear the loud whine of heavy engines echoing down the dark suburban street. 2 community security vehicles with bright amber lights flashing aggressively pulled into the circular driveway. 3 large guards jumped out of the vehicles and jogged quickly up the stone pathway toward the porch. The guard I had spoken to at the gate recognized me, but the situation had completely changed. Marcus stood in the doorway pointing a trembling finger at me, playing the role of the terrified, wealthy victim with Oscar-worthy precision. He demanded that they remove me from his property immediately and threatened to have their security company fired if they let me near his family ever again. The lead security guard placed his hand firmly on the hilt of his radio and told me I needed to step back toward my vehicle. He said that regardless of what the paperwork at the gate said, the current residents were feeling physically threatened, and I had to vacate the premises immediately to avoid local police involvement. I did not scream. I did not cry. I looked at Marcus, who was now smiling triumphantly behind the shoulders of the security guards. I let the guards escort me down the long stone pathway. I kept my head held high and my posture completely professional. I climbed into the freezing driver's seat of my dented sedan and started the struggling engine. I backed out of the massive driveway, leaving my beautiful stolen mansion behind. I drove out of the gated community with the amber lights of the security vehicles escorting me all the way to the main road, ensuring I was completely removed from the wealthy neighborhood. I merged onto the dark, empty highway, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm in my chest. I felt an overwhelming wave of sheer physical exhaustion threaten to pull me under. My parents and Marcus were not just greedy. They were highly organized, deeply malicious, and completely willing to use violence and the legal system to utterly destroy me. I needed a safe place to regroup and strategize my counterattack with Grandpa Richard. I pulled into the brightly lit parking lot of a 24-hour gas station to grab a bottle of water and steady my shaking hands. I turned off the engine and pulled my phone from my coat pocket. The bright screen illuminated the dark cabin of my car. I had a new high-priority email notification waiting in my primary inbox. The sender address made my stomach drop entirely into my shoes. It was an official automated notification from the King County Family Court System. I tapped the screen with trembling fingers and opened the message. The email contained a digital copy of an emergency legal filing that had been submitted directly to a night court judge just 30 minutes ago. I read the stark black text on the glowing screen and felt the air completely leave my lungs. My parents had officially filed an emergency petition for an involuntary psychiatric hold and a permanent legal conservatorship over me. They had submitted fraudulent medical documents, claiming I was suffering from severe paranoid delusions and posed an immediate danger to myself and others. The legal petition requested that Patricia Jenkins be granted total, absolute and permanent control over all my personal finances, my medical decisions, and my legal rights. The document stated that a judge would review the emergency petition first thing Monday morning. If the judge signed that order, I would instantly lose my legal identity. I would not be able to hire a lawyer, access my own bank accounts, or speak to federal investigators. My parents were not just trying to steal my money anymore. They were actively launching a calculated legal strike to permanently erase my existence and silence me forever. The trap had been set, and I had less than 48 hours to build a guillotine before they completely destroyed my life. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone inside the cold, dark cabin of my car. The legal document from the King County Family Court System felt like a massive physical weight crushing my chest. My own parents were petitioning the court for a permanent legal conservatorship over me. I scrolled through the attached files with trembling fingers, and my blood ran absolutely cold. They had submitted a completely fraudulent psychiatric evaluation signed by a private doctor I had never even met in my entire life. The evaluation painted a terrifying and entirely fabricated picture of my mental state. It claimed I was suffering from severe paranoid delusions, extreme manic episodes, and acute financial paranoia. My mother had provided sworn affidavits claiming that my grueling 60-hour work weeks at the hospital and my intense social isolation were actually symptoms of a severe psychiatric collapse. She wrote in her official statement that I had recently begun experiencing violent hallucinations about my family stealing money from me. It was a masterclass in weaponized gaslighting. They were using the exact felony crimes they had committed against me as legal proof that I was losing my mind. If a judge granted this conservatorship, my mother, Patricia, would gain absolute and total legal control over my entire existence. She would control my medical decisions, my physical movements, and every single financial asset attached to my name. I would be legally erased from society. I would become a ghost trapped in my own body, unable to hire a lawyer, unable to speak to federal investigators, and unable to ever testify against them in a court of law. They were legally burying me alive to protect their stolen millions and the fake luxury empire they had built for Marcus and Jessica. Panic seized my throat as I realized the immediate implications of the temporary emergency orders attached to the filing. I quickly opened my mobile banking application on my phone. The loading circle spun for a few agonizing seconds before the screen refreshed to show my accounts. My checking account balance was zero. My savings account balance was zero. The emergency court order had granted Patricia immediate temporary control over my personal finances pending the official evidentiary hearing on Monday morning. They had completely frozen my bank accounts to cut off my oxygen. I was a highly trained financial professional who had just uncovered a massive money laundering conspiracy. But in the eyes of the law, right at this very moment, I was considered mentally incompetent and stripped of my own money. I reached into my heavy winter coat pocket and pulled out my worn leather wallet. I unzipped the main compartment and counted the crumpled paper bills inside. 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. I had exactly $14 to my entire name. I was sitting in the freezing rain in the dark parking lot of a cheap gas station, holding exactly $14, while my sister and her fraudulent husband slept comfortably in my $1.5 million estate. The sheer unmatched cruelty of their strategy hit me like a freight train. They knew I was gathering evidence with Grandpa Richard. They knew I was preparing to hand their entire criminal conspiracy over to the federal authorities. So they completely severed my legs before I could take another step. Without access to my money, I could not hire my own legal defense team to fight the conservatorship on Monday. I was entirely cornered. They had backed me against a brick wall and left me with absolutely nothing. I sat in my freezing car and let the hot tears stream down my face. I cried for the little girl who just wanted her parents to love and protect her. I cried for the young woman who had sacrificed her entire 20s, working herself into the ground to help a family that secretly despised her. The emotional trauma was absolutely suffocating. In modern American society, a conservatorship is the ultimate stripping of human rights. It is designed to protect the highly vulnerable, but in the hands of malicious financial predators, it is a legal cage with no exit. My parents were perfectly willing to brand their own daughter as legally insane and lock her away in a psychiatric facility just to maintain their luxurious lifestyle. They did not care if I lost my career at the hospital. They did not care if my reputation was permanently destroyed. They only cared about protecting Marcus's fake architectural empire and Jessica's imported designer wardrobe. The depth of their depravity was almost impossible to process. I realized right then that I was not fighting misguided family members anymore. I was fighting ruthless, calculated criminals who would stop at absolutely nothing to eliminate a threat to their wealth. Just as I was wiping the tears from my face, my cell phone began to vibrate violently in my hand. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. A sickening wave of dread washed over me. I stared at the bright screen, debating whether to answer the call or throw the phone out the window. The forensic accountant inside my mind told me that I needed to gather as much intelligence as possible about their next move. I took a deep, long breath, forced my vocal cords to relax, and accepted the call. Patricia did not sound angry. She did not sound like the venomous woman who had slapped me across the face in the icy driveway just a few hours ago. Instead, her voice trembled with a perfectly manufactured sorrow. She sounded exactly like a weeping, terrified mother desperately trying to save her sick child. She cried softly into the phone, calling me her sweet girl and telling me how deeply worried she and my father were about my rapid mental decline. The performance was so chillingly authentic that if I did not know the absolute truth about the stolen equity, I would have believed she genuinely cared about my well-being. She told me that she knew I was confused and scared tonight, but that the severe legal steps they were taking were only meant to protect me from destroying myself. She fed me a steady, endless stream of toxic lies, trying to convince me that my memories of the stolen money, the forged deed, and the secret bank accounts were all part of a tragic, paranoid delusion. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my hands ached, letting her spin her elaborate web of deceit without interrupting her. Then Patricia finally revealed the true purpose of her late-night phone call. Her voice softened into a gentle, pleading whisper. She told me that Marcus was hosting his massive firm launch gala this upcoming weekend. It was the most important night of his architectural career, filled with elite investors, local politicians, and high-society real estate developers. Patricia said that the family was completely shattered by my recent erratic behavior, but they were willing to give me one last chance to make things right. She promised me that if I came to the gala, if I dressed up nicely, smiled, and made peace publicly with the family, she would call her lawyers and drop the emergency conservatorship petition immediately. She swore on her life that all they wanted was their family back together, and that seeing me behave normally at a major social event would prove to everyone, including the judge, that I was finally healing. I sat perfectly still in the driver's seat, listening to her toxic promises. My mind raced, putting the pieces of her strategy together with cold, absolute precision. My parents did not want to make peace. They did not want me to heal. They were absolutely terrified of the mountain of forensic evidence I had uncovered, and they needed an airtight guarantee that the family court judge would grant the permanent conservatorship on Monday morning. The fraudulent psychiatric paperwork they filed was strong, but a highly public, heavily documented psychiatric meltdown would make their case absolutely bulletproof. I knew exactly what they were planning to do to me. If I showed up to Marcus's luxury gala, they would greet me with warm smiles and immediately hand me a glass of champagne. They would slip heavy prescription sedatives or powerful hallucinogens into my drink. They would wait for the drugs to hit my system in a ballroom packed with 300 wealthy, influential witnesses. When I inevitably collapsed, began slurring my words, or started acting aggressively under the influence of the narcotics, they would have hundreds of highly reputable people ready to testify that I was completely out of my mind. They would orchestrate the entire breakdown record my drug-induced behavior on their cell phones and hand the pristine video footage directly to the judge on Monday. It was a perfectly designed lethal trap. They were inviting me to my own public execution. I held the phone to my ear, listening to my mother softly crying her fake tears. She begged me to please just come to the gala and let them love me again. The sheer manipulative evil required to set up your own daughter for a public drugging and permanent institutionalization was staggering. But Patricia had made one massive critical miscalculation in her flawless plan. She still thought I was the weak, obedient girl who would blindly drink whatever poison she handed me. She did not realize that I had spent the last several hours dismantling their entire financial network with a billionaire and a team of ruthless corporate lawyers. I took a very slow, steady breath. I made my voice sound incredibly small, hesitant, and deeply defeated. I told my mother that I was so tired of fighting everyone. I told her that I was scared of losing my mind and that I just wanted things to go back to normal. I promised her that I would attend Marcus's gala and do exactly what she wanted me to do to prove I was getting better. Patricia let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief, praising my decision and telling me how beautiful the night was going to be for our family. We ended the call. I lowered the phone and stared out through the rain-streaked windshield into the dark, empty night. I had exactly $14 in my pocket, and my entire legal existence was hanging by a single fragile thread. But I was going to walk straight into their trap because I knew exactly how to turn their luxurious ballroom into their absolute graveyard. I drove away from that dark gas station parking lot feeling a kind of cold clarity I had never experienced before in my entire 27 years of life. The suffocating panic that had gripped my chest just an hour ago was completely gone. My parents had played their final and most desperate card. By filing a fraudulent emergency petition for a permanent legal conservatorship over me, they had completely abandoned their roles as my mother and father. They were no longer misguided family members making terrible choices. They were ruthless financial predators actively trying to strip away my human rights and legally erase my existence to protect the millions they had stolen. They wanted to lock me in a psychiatric cage so they could continue funding my sister Jessica and her husband Marcus in their fake luxury lifestyle. They expected me to break. They expected me to show up at Marcus's architectural firm launch gala weeping and desperate for their approval, ready to swallow whatever sedatives they handed me just to make the court petition go away. Thus, they thought they had finally crushed the mediocre, invisible daughter into total submission. But they made one fatal miscalculation. They completely underestimated the woman I had become. I navigated my beat-up sedan through the quiet early morning streets of downtown Seattle and pulled into the secure underground parking garage of Grandpa Richard's luxury hotel. I took the private elevator straight up to his penthouse suite. When the heavy mahogany doors opened, the massive living area was already buzzing with intense quiet activity. Richard's private legal team had not stopped working since I left. The massive dining table was entirely covered in legal pads, glowing laptops, and empty coffee cups. Richard was sitting at the head of the table, reviewing a thick stack of printed property records. He looked up when I walked in and immediately saw the change in my posture. I did not look like a terrified victim anymore. I walked directly to the table and set my phone down. I told him exactly what Patricia had done. I explained the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation, the emergency conservatorship filing, and the frozen bank accounts that left me with exactly $14 to my name. I told him about the phone call and the sickening trap they had set for me at the gala this coming weekend. I watched the temperature in the room plummet as the reality of their pure malice settled over the legal team. Catherine, the lead attorney, immediately reached for her phone to file counter motions to block the conservatorship, but I raised my hand and stopped her. I told the room that we were not going to fight the petition in family court. I said that playing defense was exactly what my parents wanted us to do, because it would keep the battle quiet and contained behind closed legal doors. I looked at my grandfather and told him that we were going to take this entirely out of the civil court system. We were going to weaponize their incredible arrogance and turn their lavish public celebration into a federal crime scene. Richard stared at me for a long, silent moment. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his weathered face. He nodded once and told Catherine to make the call to the federal authorities. 2 hours later, the heavy doors of the penthouse suite opened again. Two sharply dressed agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation White-Collar Crime Division walked into the room. They were serious analytical men who dealt exclusively with massive financial conspiracies. They took their seats at the dining table and opened their official notebooks. I took my place at the head of the table right next to Richard. I opened my massive manila folder and I began to speak. I did not sound like a frightened daughter. I spoke with the absolute lethal precision of a certified public accountant specializing in forensic financial investigations. I walked the federal agents through every single layer of the grand lie. I started with the original property deed, proving that Richard had purchased the $1.5 million Oakwood Hills estate entirely in cash under my name 3 years ago. I then presented the perfectly forged power of attorney document showing exactly how my parents had illegally granted themselves total unchecked control over my assets. I watched the agents lean forward in their chairs as I pulled out the heavily redacted bank statements detailing the massive home equity line of credit. I showed them exactly how my parents had used my flawless credit score to drain $800,000 in raw equity out of my stolen home. But I did not stop there. I knew the federal agents needed to see the complete flow of the laundered money to build a solid conspiracy case against everyone involved. I laid out the complex web of shell companies and blind trusts that I had traced overnight. I showed them the wire transfers, proving that the stolen equity was funneled directly into a limited liability company owned entirely by Marcus. I explained how Marcus had used my stolen money to provide the massive seed funding for his supposedly self-made luxury architecture firm. I showed the agents the transaction logs matching the exact dates of Jessica and Marcus's lavish vacations to Dubai and Paris. I handed them the utility bills and voter registration records proving that Marcus and Jessica were currently occupying the stolen mansion. I connected every single dot, painting a flawless, undeniable picture of identity theft, wire fraud, and massive money laundering. Finally, I told the federal agents about the emergency conservatorship petition and the trap my parents had set for me at the upcoming gala. I explained that my parents were planning to drug me in front of 300 elite guests to manufacture a public psychiatric meltdown. I told the agents that Marcus and my parents believed they were utterly untouchable because they thought they were dealing with a powerless, broke clerk. The lead agent slowly closed his notebook. He looked at the mountain of perfect forensic evidence I had organized on the table and told me it was one of the most comprehensive financial tracking profiles he had ever seen from a civilian. He confirmed that the wire fraud across state lines immediately escalated this to a major federal crime. He said they had more than enough probable cause to secure immediate arrest warrants for David, Patricia, and Marcus. He looked at Richard and asked how we wanted to proceed. I did not hesitate for a single second. I told the federal agents that I was going to accept my mother's invitation. I was going to walk straight into their trap at the gala on Saturday night. I wanted the agents waiting in the wings of the ballroom. I wanted Marcus to stand on a stage in front of all his wealthy investors and local politicians and feel the absolute height of his fake power before we ripped it all away. The agents agreed to the tactical plan. They would coordinate a massive multi-agency raid perfectly timed to my signal. The federal agents left the penthouse to secure the warrants, leaving me alone with Richard and his legal team. The forensic trap was set, but I needed absolute control over the physical environment of the ballroom to execute my plan perfectly. If my parents were planning to drug my drink and Marcus was planning to use the massive audio-visual system to showcase his fake empire, I needed to own the battlefield. I turned to my grandfather and explained the logistical problem. I told him we could not simply walk into a private high-security gala without Marcus's event staff intervening. We needed inside access to the catering team and the technical production crew. Richard leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers together. He told me that true power is entirely invisible. He said that people like Marcus and Jessica only understand the loud, flashy performance of wealth, but they have absolutely no idea how real money actually moves in the dark. Richard picked up his phone and made 3 short phone calls to his private holding company. He did not ask to hire the vendors working the gala. He used his massive, limitless wealth to execute immediate aggressive corporate buyouts. Within exactly 4 hours, Richard's holding company became the majority stakeholder and legal owner of the premium catering company, providing the food and beverages for the gala. 1 hour later, he successfully purchased the parent company of the elite audio-visual production firm, managing the ballroom's massive screens and sound system. By Friday afternoon, we completely owned every single vendor operating inside Marcus's event. We controlled the staff pouring the drinks, and we controlled the technology running the presentation. The trap they had set for me was now entirely in my hands. With the technical production company under our direct corporate ownership, I was granted immediate top-level administrative access to the gala's central presentation servers. I sat in the hotel suite with my laptop glowing in the dim evening light and logged into this secure network. I easily located Marcus's highly guarded presentation folder. I opened his files and felt a sharp wave of disgust wash over me. His presentation was titled "The Self-Made Visionary, Building an Empire from the Ground Up." The slides were filled with arrogant quotes, exaggerated financial projections, and beautifully rendered architectural models. He was planning to stand on a stage and beg elite investors for millions of dollars while pretending he was a brilliant bootstrapping entrepreneur. I hovered my cursor over his presentation file and pressed the delete key. I watched his entire fake legacy vanish into the digital trash bin. In its place, I uploaded a brand new presentation that I had meticulously designed over the past 24 hours. I created dozens of stark high-contrast slides featuring the undeniable physical proof of their crimes. I uploaded massive high-resolution images of the forged power of attorney documents, perfectly highlighting the fake signatures. I added detailed flowcharts showing the exact path of the stolen $800,000, moving from my fraudulent credit line directly into Marcus's business accounts. I included side-by-side slides showing the bank withdrawals next to Jessica's arrogant social media posts from her luxury vacations. I uploaded the utility bills proving they were squatting in my stolen home. I even included a massive slide displaying the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation my parents had filed to try and silence me. I set the new presentation to run on an encrypted automated loop that could not be paused, skipped, or shut down from the podium. When Marcus clicked his remote to begin his speech, he would completely lose control of the massive screens behind him. I was building a digital guillotine, and I was making absolutely certain that the blade was perfectly sharp. The morning of the gala finally arrived. I woke up in the luxury guest bedroom of Richard's penthouse suite, feeling an eerie absolute calm. The frantic, desperate panic that had ruled my life for the past week was completely extinguished. I walked into the massive marble bathroom and looked at my reflection in the brightly lit mirror. The faint shadow of the bruise on my cheek where my mother had slapped me was easily concealed with a layer of foundation. I took a long hot shower, washing away the final remnants of the terrified, exhausted medical billing clerk. Richard had arranged for a private stylist to bring a selection of evening gowns to the suite. I did not choose anything flashy or overly dramatic. I selected a tailored, sleek midnight blue evening gown that fit me perfectly. It was elegant, powerful, and commanded absolute respect. I paired it with simple, understated jewelry. I pulled my hair back into a severe, flawless style that left my face completely open and unapologetic. I slipped my feet into a pair of sharp designer heels. I did not look like a broken daughter begging for her family's love. I looked like an executioner. I stood in the massive living area of the penthouse, looking out over the glittering skyline of downtown Seattle. The sun was setting, casting long, dark shadows across the city streets below. Richard wheeled his chair over to the window and stopped beside me. He was dressed in an immaculate dark tailored suit, looking every bit the ruthless billionaire who had conquered the real estate world. He looked at me with profound pride in his eyes. He told me that my parents had spent my entire life trying to convince me that I was weak and insignificant so they could steal my future without any resistance. He said they had mistaken my quiet endurance for stupidity. He reached out and gently squeezed my hand, telling me it was time to show them exactly who they had messed with. I nodded slowly, feeling the cold steel of my resolve lock firmly into place. I picked up my small evening clutch, knowing that the federal agents were already moving into their hidden positions around the perimeter of the downtown ballroom. My parents and Marcus were putting on their expensive clothes, right now completely convinced they were about to secure their stolen millions and lock me away in a psychiatric ward forever. They thought they had perfectly orchestrated my tragic public downfall. They had absolutely no idea that they were simply walking onto a stage that I now completely owned. I took one final deep breath of the quiet air in the penthouse suite, turning my back on the Seattle skyline. It was time to walk straight into the lion's den and burn their entire fake kingdom to the ground. The heavy brass doors of the Grand Emerald Ballroom swung open, and the sheer magnitude of the lie hit me like a physical wave of heat. The downtown Seattle venue was an absolute fortress of manufactured luxury. A massive crystal chandelier hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting a warm golden glow over 300 of the city's most elite socialites. A live string quartet played softly in the corner, filling the cavernous space with elegant classical music that perfectly masked the sound of stolen money. Everywhere I looked, there were local politicians, high-powered real estate developers, and wealthy investors mingling in expensive custom-tailored suits and shimmering designer gowns. Waiters in crisp white jackets floated silently through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with premium champagne and high-end hors d'oeuvres. It was a masterpiece of illusion. Every single detail of this breathtaking gala, every silk napkin, every imported flower arrangement, and every drop of expensive liquor had been paid for by the massive fraudulent credit line my parents had secretly chained to my identity. I stepped fully into the light of the ballroom, wearing the sleek midnight blue evening gown Grandpa Richard's stylist had provided. I stood at the top of the grand staircase overlooking the glittering crowd and took a deep, steadying breath. I did not shrink. I did not lower my eyes. For 27 years, I had walked into family events, making myself as small and invisible as humanly possible, so I would not upset my mother or trigger my sister's relentless jealousy. I was always the exhausted medical billing clerk in the cheap thrift store, carrying the weight of their constant disappointment. But the woman standing at the top of those stairs tonight was entirely different. I was fully aware that federal agents were silently waiting in the perimeter shadows, and that a digital guillotine was perfectly loaded on the presentation servers, pulsing quietly in the background. I was walking straight into the lion's den, but I was the one holding the torch. My eyes scanned the massive room, quickly locating the architects of my destruction. Marcus and Jessica were standing near the center of the ballroom, holding absolute court like suburban royalty. Marcus was wearing a flawless bespoke black tuxedo that fit his tall frame perfectly. He was holding a glass of dark amber scotch, gesturing broadly as he spoke to a highly influential city councilman and a prominent commercial developer. He looked so incredibly arrogant, so utterly convinced of his own self-manufactured genius. Jessica stood right beside him, wearing a breathtaking silver sequins gown that draped perfectly over her figure. She was smiling that bright, practiced smile, playing the role of the devoted, wealthy wife to absolute perfection. She laughed at something the developer said, placing a manicured hand lightly on Marcus's chest. They were selling the narrative of the self-made visionary empire, completely oblivious to the fact that I knew their entire kingdom was built on felony wire fraud and my ruined credit score. A few yards away, near the massive ice sculpture decorating the main bar, I spotted my parents. David and Patricia were working the room with their own brand of sickening perfection. My father was laughing with a group of older investors holding a crystal tumbler and projecting the image of a proud, successful patriarch. My mother was standing nearby, wearing an expensive, deep burgundy dress, holding a delicate clutch, and smiling warmly at a group of wealthy wives. They looked like the absolute picture of respectable American success. They were the perfect, loving parents celebrating their golden son-in-law. Seeing them stand there, radiating such absolute confidence, while actively plotting to have their own daughter legally erased and locked in a psychiatric facility, made my blood run entirely cold. The sheer depth of their sociopathic greed was almost impossible for a normal human mind to process. I slowly descended the grand staircase, my heels clicking softly against the polished marble steps. As I moved through the crowd, I could feel a few eyes turning my way. I was a stranger to these elite developers and politicians, but I carried myself with an undeniable authority. I kept my posture completely rigid and my expression calm. I did not rush. I let the ambience of the room wash over me, listening to the snippets of wealthy conversation regarding investment portfolios and summer homes in the Hamptons. None of these powerful people had absolutely any idea that they were rubbing shoulders with desperate criminals who had stolen almost $1 million from a hospital clerk. It took less than 2 minutes for the trap to spring. Patricia spotted me from across the room. I saw her entire body stiffen for a fraction of a second before the perfectly constructed mask of the weeping, concerned mother slammed back into place. She quickly tapped David on the arm, whispering something urgent into his ear. David's eyes darted through the crowd until they locked onto me. His face hardened instantly into a look of severe warning, but he quickly smoothed it out into a tight, unconvincing smile for the investors standing around him. Patricia immediately broke away from her conversation and began power walking through the glittering crowd directly toward me. As she approached, I forced my facial muscles to relax. I dropped my shoulders slightly and allowed a look of deep exhaustion and hesitant fear to enter my eyes. I had to play the exact role they expected me to play. I had to be the broken, terrified daughter, desperate for their love and willing to surrender entirely to their control. Patricia reached me and immediately threw her arms around my shoulders, pulling me into a suffocating, highly performative hug. I could smell the heavy, expensive perfume radiating off her neck. She squeezed me tightly, making sure the guests standing nearby could see the loving embrace of a mother welcoming her troubled child. She pulled back, keeping her hands firmly on my upper arms, and looked deeply into my eyes. Her voice was incredibly soft, dripping with a toxic, manufactured sweetness that made my skin crawl. She told me she was so incredibly proud of me for being brave enough to come tonight. She whispered that she knew how hard the last few days had been for my mental health, but that seeing me here dressed so beautifully proved that I was finally ready to accept the family's help. She spoke to me as if I were a fragile glass doll that might shatter at any moment. She promised me again that as long as I smiled for the cameras and caused absolutely no drama, the horrible legal paperwork regarding the conservatorship would simply disappear on Monday morning. She was actively gaslighting me right there on the polished marble floor of the ballroom, treating the felony theft of my home and the destruction of my credit as nothing more than a symptom of my own tragic paranoia. I nodded slowly, looking down at the marble floor to sell the performance of my complete submission. I told her in a very quiet, shaking voice that I just wanted the fighting to stop. I told her I was so tired of feeling crazy and that I just wanted to be part of the family again. Patricia let out a loud, dramatic sigh of absolute relief. Her eyes flashed with a terrifying, triumphant gleam. She believed she had won. She believed she had successfully broken the only person standing between her and federal prison. She gently rubbed my arm and told me that everything was going to be perfectly fine now. Then she turned her head slightly and made a very specific, sharp eye contact with a waiter standing near the edge of the bar. The waiter immediately nodded and began walking toward us carrying a small silver tray. The tray held exactly 2 crystal flutes filled with bubbling champagne. My heart began to hammer a frantic, violent rhythm against my ribs. The forensic accountant inside my brain screamed at me to document every single detail of this interaction. I watched my mother's hands very closely. The waiter stopped in front of us and lowered the tray. Patricia reached out with graceful precision and bypassed the glass closest to her. She deliberately picked up the crystal flute sitting on the far left side of the silver tray. She held it by the delicate glass stem and turned back to me with a brilliant, loving smile. She held the glass out toward me. She told me we needed to make a toast to fresh starts, to healing, and to our beautiful family finally coming back together. She pushed the glass slightly closer to my chest, waiting for me to take it. I knew exactly what was inside that specific crystal flute. I knew that within the sparkling golden liquid was a heavy dose of powerful sedatives or potent hallucinogens. I knew that if I swallowed that champagne within 20 minutes, my vision would blur, my speech would slur, and I would collapse onto the ballroom floor in front of 300 elite witnesses. I knew they would record my drug-induced meltdown and present it to the family court judge as undeniable, absolute proof that I was a severe danger to myself, requiring a permanent legal conservatorship. They were handing me the literal poison that would end my free existence forever. I reached out and took the cold crystal glass from her hand. I looked my mother directly in the eyes and gave her a soft, incredibly grateful smile. I told her thank you. I told her I really needed a fresh start tonight. Patricia beamed, holding her own safe glass of champagne. Just as she opened her mouth to propose the toast, a heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder. It was my father. David had navigated through the crowd and stepped up right beside my mother. He was holding his own half-empty crystal tumbler of dark amber scotch. He looked at me with a hard, patronizing stare, completely devoid of any actual paternal affection. He leaned in slightly, his voice carrying a low, threatening edge, perfectly disguised as fatherly advice. He told me he was glad I decided to be smart and show up. He whispered that making a scene tonight would be the biggest mistake of my entire life. I held the poisoned champagne flute firmly in my right hand, feeling the cold condensation gathering on the crystal stem. I needed a distraction. I needed exactly 1 second of diverted attention to execute the counterattack I had been planning since I left Grandpa Richard's penthouse suite. The universe delivered the distraction flawlessly. A loud, sudden burst of laughter erupted from a group of wealthy investors directly behind my father. One of the men, a loud, boisterous real estate developer holding a massive unlit cigar, accidentally bumped hard into David's back. David stumbled forward slightly, letting out a sharp grunt of annoyance. He spun around immediately, raising his hands to steady himself and barking a harsh reprimand at the careless investor. Patricia instantly turned her head toward the commotion, her eyes darting away from me to ensure David did not cause a scene in front of Marcus's elite clients. Their absolute focus was entirely broken. It was the perfect, flawless millisecond. My hands moved with lightning speed and terrifying precision. Without making a single sound, I smoothly lowered the poisoned crystal flute in my right hand and simultaneously reached out with my left. I gently slid my fingers around the heavy base of David's crystal scotch tumbler, resting loosely in his distracted grip. In one seamless, invisible motion, I pulled his untainted scotch into my left hand and slid the poisoned champagne glass perfectly between his fingers. Because both glasses were heavy crystal and the movement was executed so flawlessly in the middle of a chaotic crowd, David's brain did not register the subtle shift in weight or shape. David turned back around, still scowling at the loud investor behind him. Patricia turned back to face me, smoothing the front of her expensive burgundy dress. Neither of them had absolutely any idea what had just transpired. I stood there looking incredibly small and submissive, holding my father's half-empty glass of amber scotch. David grumbled something under his breath about the careless guests. He did not look down at his hand. He simply raised the poisoned crystal flute of champagne to his mouth and took a massive angry swallow of the cold liquid. I watched his throat swallow the sedatives meant to destroy my life. A cold, dark satisfaction bloomed deep inside my chest. I took a very slow sip of his expensive scotch, letting the burning liquid coat my throat. I smiled at my parents and told them I was so incredibly ready to watch Marcus give his big presentation. I stood in the shadows of the elevated sound booth, clutching a heavy wireless microphone in my hand. From my vantage point, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the entire ballroom. The crystal chandelier slowly dimmed, casting a dramatic and expectant hush over the 300 elite guests. Conversations faded away as a lone bright spotlight illuminated the center of the massive stage. I watched my brother-in-law Marcus confidently stride up the carpeted steps, adjusting the cuffs of his custom-tailored tuxedo. The crowd erupted into polite, supportive applause. In the very front row, my sister Jessica was beaming with manufactured absolute pride. My parents, David and Patricia, sat right beside her, applauding loudly, playing the roles of the perfect supportive in-laws. Patricia was likely still patting herself on the back, completely convinced that the poisoned champagne she had handed me was already working its way through my bloodstream. She had absolutely no idea I had seamlessly traded it to my father. Marcus reached the sleek acrylic podium and flashed a brilliant practice smile. He tapped the microphone and began his highly rehearsed speech. He spoke with the smooth, calculated cadence of a man who believed his own lies. He welcomed the city council members, the wealthy real estate developers, and the private investors. He told them a beautiful, inspiring story about his humble beginnings. He claimed he had built Pinnacle Design Group from absolutely nothing, armed with only a singular vision and a relentless work ethic. He spoke about the sleepless nights, the massive personal sacrifices, and the incredible financial risks he had taken to become a self-made visionary in the luxury architecture space. It was a spectacular and sickening performance. I watched the elite crowd nodding along, completely captivated by his arrogant charisma. They were eating right out of the palm of his hand. Then Marcus paused for dramatic effect. He held up a small black wireless remote. He told the audience that he did not just want to talk about his success. He wanted to show them exactly what the future of luxury real estate looked like. He pointed the remote toward the massive digital screens spanning the entire back wall of the stage and confidently pushed the button. He expected the screens to display his breathtaking three-dimensional architectural renderings. He expected the crowd to gasp in awe at his beautiful designs. Instead, the massive screens went completely pitch black for 2 agonizing seconds. A low hum resonated through the ballroom sound system. Then a blindingly bright, high-resolution image flashed across the 20-foot display. It was not a luxury building. It was a massive, perfectly clear scan of the general durable power of attorney document. A wave of confused murmurs rippled through the audience. People squinted, trying to read the dense legal text. Marcus frowned deeply, looking over his shoulder at the giant screen. He chuckled nervously, tapping the microphone and apologizing for the technical glitch. He aimed the remote at the sound booth and aggressively clicked the button 3 more times, trying to force the system to advance to his actual presentation. The automated loop I had programmed simply moved to the next slide. A giant red circle appeared on the screen, perfectly highlighting the forged signature of my name at the bottom of the legal document. Marcus's confident smile faltered. His face drained of color as he recognized exactly what was towering behind him. He stepped away from the podium, waving his hands frantically at the production crew I had fully bought out hours ago. He hissed into his microphone, demanding that they cut the visual feed immediately. The technicians sitting just a few feet away from me simply ignored him, staring blankly at their monitors. The massive screen flashed again. This time it displayed the highly confidential bank statements from the national mortgage lender. The words "home equity line of credit" were plastered across the top in bold black letters. The screen zoomed in aggressively on the total loan amount of $800,000. The crowd grew incredibly quiet. The polite murmurs vanished, replaced by a sharp, chilling silence. Elite investors and politicians know exactly how to read a financial statement. They knew they were looking at a massive raw debt file. I stepped out of the shadows of the sound booth. I walked slowly down the carpeted aisle toward the center of the ballroom. I raised my secondary microphone to my lips. My voice echoed through the massive speakers, cutting through the dead silence with absolute crystal clarity. I told the audience to please pay close attention to the screens. I introduced myself to the 300 strangers staring at me. I said my name was Sarah Jenkins, and I was the completely invisible sister-in-law to the great self-made visionary currently standing on their stage. I kept my voice incredibly calm, steady, and ruthlessly professional. I did not yell or scream. I delivered the facts like a lethal injection. I pointed to the massive screen as the next slide automatically triggered. It showed the undeniable forensic trail of wire transfers. The red arrows physically connected the withdrawn funds from my fraudulently opened credit line directly into the primary business checking accounts of Pinnacle Design Group. The exact routing numbers and dates were magnified for everyone to see. I told the crowd that Marcus did not build a single inch of his architectural firm with his own money. I explained that his entire business was financed through a highly organized criminal conspiracy involving felony identity theft and massive wire fraud. I told the investors that the confident genius pitching them his vision had actually stolen $800,000 in raw equity from a house that legally belonged to me. I explained that he and my sister had used a forged signature to completely annihilate my credit score so they could play pretend in the high society real estate market. Complete chaos began to ripple through the ballroom. Wealthy developers were pulling out their smartphones, zooming in on the screen, taking pictures of the routing numbers. The city councilman standing near the front row actually took a physical step backward, away from the stage, as if Marcus had suddenly caught a highly contagious disease. Marcus was completely panicking now. He grabbed the edges of the acrylic podium, gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned stark white. He shouted into his microphone, claiming that I was a deranged lunatic. He screamed that the documents were fake and that I was a jealous, psychotic sister trying to ruin his life because I was a miserable, broke failure. I did not even blink. I just smiled, a cold, completely empty smile. The automated presentation clicked to the next slide. The screen lit up with a side-by-side comparison. On the left was a bank withdrawal record showing $45,000 taken from my stolen equity. On the right was a massive projection of Jessica's public social media posts showing her and Marcus drinking champagne in a first-class private suite flying to Dubai. The dates matched flawlessly. The next slide showed a $12,000 withdrawal matched perfectly to an image of Jessica holding bags of designer shoes in Paris. I told the crowd that the self-made man standing before them was actively laundering stolen money to fund a lavish, fraudulent lifestyle. I revealed that they were currently living in a $1.5 million mansion in Oakwood Hills that was entirely registered in my name. I told the investors to ask themselves a very simple question. If a man is willing to steal $1 million from his own sister-in-law and ruin her life to fund a vacation, what exactly would he do to their investment capital? Jessica jumped out of her front row seat. Her silver designer gown shimmered under the harsh lights as she pointed a shaking finger at me. She shrieked at the top of her lungs, telling me to shut my mouth. She screamed for security, demanding that they forcefully remove me from the venue, but the security guards did not move an inch. Grandpa Richard had bought out the venue management too. The guards simply stood at the doors, arms crossed, watching the incredible public execution unfold. My mother, Patricia, finally broke. She rushed into the center aisle, stepping between me and the stage. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. She looked at the wealthy crowd and desperately tried to deploy her final weapon. She raised her voice, putting on her fake weeping mother performance. She cried out to the room, begging them not to listen to me. She shouted that I was suffering from a severe psychiatric breakdown. She yelled that I was deeply paranoid and having violent manic delusions about the family finances. She claimed they were desperately trying to get me medical help. I looked at my mother with absolute profound disgust. I raised my hand, and the final slide of my presentation triggered on the massive 20-foot screens. The room gasped collectively. The slide was a perfect high-resolution scan of the emergency conservatorship petition my parents had filed with the King County Family Court. I had highlighted the specific fraudulent psychiatric evaluation they submitted. I read the exact text out loud to the room. I explained how my loving parents, realizing I had finally discovered their massive financial crimes, had actively conspired to silence me forever. I told the horrified crowd that my parents had faked a medical evaluation to permanently strip away my human rights, lock me in a psychiatric facility, and gain total legal control over my voice, just to cover up their felony theft. I pointed directly at Patricia, who was now completely frozen in the middle of the aisle. I told the room that my mother had invited me to this gala tonight under the guise of making peace. I revealed that her actual plan was to slip a heavy sedative into my champagne glass and orchestrate a public drug-induced meltdown to prove to a judge that I was clinically insane. The silence in the ballroom was absolute and deafening. The sheer magnitude of the evil I had just exposed was too immense for the elite crowd to ignore. They were not looking at a family dispute. They were looking at a highly coordinated, vicious criminal syndicate operating under the guise of suburban perfection. My father, David, finally realized the absolute finality of the situation. He had been standing near the front row, clutching his chest. He looked up at the massive screen showing his forged signature on the legal documents. He looked at the horrified, disgusted faces of the wealthy investors pulling away from him. He suddenly swayed on his feet. The poison scotch he had unknowingly consumed was finally hitting his bloodstream. His eyes rolled back into his head, and he collapsed hard onto the polished marble floor. He landed with a sickening thud, completely incapacitated by the exact trap he had designed for me. Patricia screamed, dropping to her knees next to his unconscious body. Jessica was sobbing hysterically, gripping the edge of a dining table as her entire fraudulent universe burned to the ground in front of her. Marcus stood frozen on the stage, perfectly illuminated by the spotlight, looking at the shattered remains of his fake legacy. He was entirely trapped. I stood in the center of the ballroom, looking at the absolute wreckage of my biological family. I did not feel a single drop of pity. I lowered my microphone as the heavy wooden doors at the back of the grand ballroom suddenly swung open. The blinding red and blue lights of multiple emergency vehicles flashed from the street outside. 24 federal agents from the white-collar crime division swarmed into the room, their badges prominently displayed, walking with absolute lethal purpose toward the stage. The trap had perfectly closed. I had brought the guillotine, and the blade had finally dropped. If you are listening to this right now and you have ever felt entirely powerless against the toxic, manipulative people in your life, I want you to remember this exact moment. You are never as trapped as they want you to believe. You have the power to dismantle their entire reality with nothing but the absolute truth. Please drop a comment right now and tell me how you would have handled this confrontation. Would you have let them destroy themselves publicly, or would you have walked away? Let me know down below. And if you are ready to hear the final incredible fallout of this nightmare, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because the justice served in the end is something you will absolutely never forget. The silence in the grand ballroom did not last long. It shattered into a million jagged pieces of absolute bedlam. 300 of Seattle's most elite politicians, luxury real estate developers, and wealthy socialites erupted into a deafening chorus of gasps, shouts, and panicked whispers. I stood perfectly still in the center of the massive room, holding my secondary microphone and breathing in the cool air of the venue. The gigantic digital screens behind the stage were still glowing brightly, displaying the undeniable forensic proof of the massive financial crimes committed by my own flesh and blood. Every single person in that room had just seen the forged legal signatures and the stolen wire transfers. They had just read the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation my parents had filed to try and lock me away forever. The illusion of the perfect self-made family was entirely dead. I watched the absolute terror wash over my brother-in-law Marcus. He was standing on the elevated stage, clutching the acrylic podium with shaking hands. The confident, arrogant visionary who had been holding court just 10 minutes ago was completely gone. In his place was a terrified, exposed fraud. The wealthy investor standing near the front of the stage physically backed away from him. It was as if an invisible force field had suddenly expanded, pushing the elite crowd away from the epicenter of the crime. Men in expensive custom suits and women in glittering gowns recoiled in sheer disgust. No one wanted to be standing anywhere near a man who had just been outed as a federal money launderer. Marcus looked out at the sea of disgusted faces and opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no words came out. His entire fake empire was evaporating right before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Suddenly, a loud metallic crash violently echoed across the left side of the ballroom. I turned my head and watched my father David lose his battle with gravity. The heavy dose of sedatives my mother had slipped into that crystal champagne flute, the exact same poison they had intended for me, was fully taking over his central nervous system. David staggered forward, his eyes rolling wildly in his head. His face was pale and slick with a cold sweat. He let out a loud, confused groan and desperately reached out to grab something to steady himself. His heavy hands caught the edge of a tall cocktail table covered in expensive appetizers and tall glass vases. He could not hold his own weight. David collapsed forward, pulling the entire heavy table down with him. The table flipped over, sending a mountain of glass plates, shrimp cocktails, and floral arrangements crashing onto the polished marble floor. The loud sound of shattering glass pierced through the shouting crowd. David hit the ground hard, landing directly in the middle of the mess he had created. He tried to push himself up on his hands and knees, but his arms simply gave out. The powerful narcotics had completely paralyzed his motor skills. He slumped back onto the wet marble floor, drooling slightly, his eyes fluttering shut as the drugs forced him into a deep, unnatural sleep. It was the most poetic and satisfying justice I could have ever imagined. My father had stood in his suburban driveway and threatened to frame me for a federal drug crime to protect his stolen millions. Now he was lying unconscious in a puddle of spilled champagne, paralyzed by the very drugs he had conspired to use against his own daughter. My mother, Patricia, watched her husband collapse into the shattered glass and completely lost the final shred of her sanity. The carefully constructed mask of the weeping, concerned mother disintegrated into absolute feral rage. She realized in that exact moment that her perfect life was over. The stolen money, the luxury cars, the fake social status, and her pristine suburban reputation were all burning to ash. She whipped her head around and locked her manic, furious eyes directly onto me. Her face was twisted into a horrific snarl of pure, unadulterated hatred. She let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed over the chaotic noise of the ballroom. She lifted the hem of her expensive, deep burgundy designer dress and lunged straight at me. She threw her arms forward, aiming her manicured hands directly at my throat like a wild animal cornered in a trap. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I stood my ground knowing I was completely protected. Before Patricia could even get within 5 feet of me, Grandpa Richard's private security detail materialized out of the shadows. 2 massive men in dark tailored suits stepped smoothly in front of me, moving with terrifying speed and precision. One of the guards caught Patricia by the shoulders, easily absorbing her forward momentum. He grabbed her wrists, twisted her arms behind her back, and forced her aggressively down onto the hard marble floor. Patricia screamed and thrashed wildly, kicking her expensive heels against the polished stone. She shrieked my name, calling me a monster and an ungrateful parasite. She yelled that I had ruined everything and that she wished I had died in the freezing rain all those years ago. The elite guests of the gala watched in absolute stunned horror as the respectable suburban matriarch writhed on the floor screaming vicious obscenities while being pinned down by private security. I looked down at her struggling form and felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no sadness, just the cold, clean emptiness of closure. Then the heavy double doors at the back entrance of the grand ballroom swung violently open. The loud, sharp voice of federal authority cut through the screaming and the chaos. A dozen federal agents from the white-collar crime division swarmed into the luxurious venue, moving with highly coordinated tactical precision. They were wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation printed across the back. They marched directly into the sea of wealthy socialites, parting the crowd like the Red Sea. The contrast between the glittering crystal chandeliers, the elegant string music, and the grim reality of federal law enforcement was absolutely cinematic. The lead agent, a tall, imposing man with a stern face, walked directly to the center of the room. He pulled out a thick stack of official warrants and raised his voice so everyone in the enormous space could hear him clearly. He announced that he was executing multiple federal arrest warrants for identity theft, aggravated wire fraud, bank fraud, and criminal conspiracy. The elite crowd, completely silenced by the sheer magnitude of the raid, backed away against the walls to give the agents a wide, clear path. 2 agents immediately approached the stage where Marcus was still standing frozen behind the acrylic podium. They marched up the carpeted steps, grabbed Marcus by the arms, and spun him around. Marcus did not fight back. The arrogant, confident visionary had completely evaporated. He was nothing more than a terrified, trembling coward. The agents pulled his arms behind his back, and the sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the room. The lead agent loudly read Marcus his rights, stating clearly that he was being arrested for receiving stolen federal funds, grand larceny, and systemic money laundering. On the other side of the room, 2 more federal agents knelt down next to my unconscious father. They hauled David's limp, heavy body up from the shattered glass and spilled champagne. Because he was completely incapacitated by the sedatives, they had to drag him upright, supporting his dead weight between them. They snapped the heavy steel handcuffs over his wrists, officially placing him under federal arrest for felony identity theft and bank fraud, while he was entirely unaware of his own downfall. 2 female agents stepped over to my mother, who was still pinned against the marble floor by Richard's security team. The private guard stepped back, allowing the federal agents to take over. They hauled Patricia roughly to her feet. Her expensive burgundy dress was wrinkled and stained. Her immaculate hair was a tangled, chaotic mess around her face. She was weeping hysterically now, begging the agents to let her go, claiming it was all a huge misunderstanding. The agents ignored her entirely, slapping the cold steel cuffs onto her wrists and reading her the exact same list of devastating federal charges. She had forged my signature, stolen $1 million, and tried to lock me in a psychiatric ward to cover her tracks. Now, she was going to spend the rest of her natural life locked inside a federal penitentiary. My sister, Jessica, was completely broken. She fell to her knees in the middle of the ballroom, dropping her expensive designer clutch onto the floor. Her beautiful silver sequins gown pooled around her on the cold marble as she sobbed hysterically. She buried her face in her hands, screaming for her husband and crying out for her mother. The perfect, wealthy socialite persona she had crafted for years was completely obliterated. She was left with absolutely nothing but the humiliating reality of her complicity in the destruction of her own sister. She watched through floods of dark makeup-stained tears as the federal agents began marching her husband and her parents out of the venue. The 3 criminals were paraded straight down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. The entire room of elite investors, politicians, and high society developers watched in sheer disgusted silence as the fraudulent family was dragged away in chains. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers waiting out on the street illuminated the grand foyer, casting harsh flashing shadows across the expensive marble walls. I stood near the sound booth, flanked by Grandpa Richard and his legal team, watching them walk toward the exit. Patricia looked over her shoulder right before she was pushed through the main doors. She locked eyes with me one final time. I did not smile. I did not frown. My face was a mask of absolute, unbroken calm. I had walked into their perfectly designed snare and turned it into their public execution. I stood my ground, breathing in the quiet air of the ballroom, knowing that the terrified invisible girl they had abused for 27 years was finally and permanently free. 6 months have passed since that terrifying night in the grand ballroom. 6 months since the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the polished marble foyer and took my entire biological family away in heavy steel handcuffs. The federal justice system is often known to move incredibly slowly for some, but when you hand a team of aggressive federal agents a perfectly documented, pristine mountain of forensic evidence wrapped in a bow, the wheels of justice turn with a terrifying and absolute efficiency. My parents, David and Patricia, did not even try to take their case to a jury trial. Their highly paid defense attorneys looked at the overwhelming, undeniable proof of the wire transfers, the perfectly forged power of attorney documents, and the completely fraudulent psychiatric evaluations, and immediately advised them to take a plea deal. I sat in the back row of the federal courtroom and watched the judge sentence both of the people who brought me into this world to significant time in a federal penitentiary. They stood before the towering wooden bench, wearing standard-issue bright orange jumpsuits, completely stripped of their suburban perfection and their manufactured prestige. My mother, Patricia, the woman who cared so deeply about her neighborhood reputation and her imported designer clothes, looked incredibly small gray and entirely defeated. She did not look back at me as the armed bailiff escorted her out of the courtroom to begin her sentence. My father, David, the man who casually threatened to frame his own daughter for a severe narcotics felony, kept his head bowed, staring blankly at the floor as he officially traded his comfortable stolen life for a cold concrete cell. They had gambled absolutely everything on their sheer arrogance and their belief that I was too weak to fight back, and they lost absolutely everything. Marcos faced a much harsher and highly public reality. The federal investigators completely dismantled his fake architectural empire piece by piece, pulling back the curtain on his massive fraud. The government seized his luxurious downtown office, liquidating every custom drafting table, every expensive computer, and every piece of imported furniture to begin paying back the defrauded banks and the massive penalties. His name was permanently and irrevocably disgraced in the elite real estate and architectural communities. The brilliant self-made visionary was exposed to the entire city as nothing more than a desperate, malicious con artist who stole from his own family. The federal judge did not show him a single ounce of leniency during his sentencing hearing. Marcus was sentenced to a full decade behind bars for receiving stolen federal funds, grand larceny, and systemic money laundering. He traded his custom-tailored Italian suits and his heavy, solid gold Rolex for a standard federal inmate number and a view of razor wire. But the most profound and catastrophic fall from grace belonged entirely to my sister Jessica. Because she was technically shielded from the direct wire fraud charges by Marcus and my parents, she managed to avoid federal prison time, but she avoided absolutely nothing else. The government aggressively seized all of her tainted assets, including the matching jet black Mercedes SUVs, the extensive designer wardrobes, the expensive jewelry, and the luxury bank accounts. Jessica was left entirely and completely bankrupt. For her entire life, she had been the golden child, handed absolutely everything on a silver platter, never having to lift a finger or develop a single practical skill. The real world hit her with a brutal, unforgiving force. Last I heard, the glorious visionary who used to fly first class to Dubai and Paris for weekend shopping sprees was now working a grueling minimum wage retail job at a discount department store on the edge of town. The woman who once sneered at my thrift store dresses and mocked my hardworking lifestyle now wears a stiff, uncomfortable polyester uniform, standing on her feet for 9 exhausting hours a day just to barely survive the month. She lives in a cramped, rundown motel on the outskirts of the city, a dark, depressing place crawling with roaches and smelling heavily of stale cigarette smoke. There is absolutely no one left to fund her delusions of grandeur or cater to her endless demands. She's finally forced to live the exact miserable, agonizing life she always believed I deserved. As for me, I drove back to the Oakwood Hills estate a few weeks after the federal indictments were officially finalized and the property was cleared. This time, I did not have to argue with a suspicious security guard at the gate. The heavy, wrought iron gates swung open smoothly and respectfully, welcoming me to my own home. I parked my beat-up 10-year-old sedan in the massive circular driveway, right where those stolen luxury SUVs used to sit. I walked up the long, elegant stone pathway and unlocked the heavy mahogany front doors with my own newly minted key. I stepped into the grand foyer and let the absolute peaceful silence of the massive house wash over me. The house was entirely empty. The thieves were completely gone. The air inside felt crisp, clean, and incredibly light. I walked slowly through the massive living room, running my hands over the cool, dark wood of the staircase banister. I stood in the center of the gorgeous chef kitchen, where my sister used to play pretend host to her wealthy fake friends. It was finally all mine. Not just on a hidden piece of forged paper locked in a filing cabinet, but in actual undeniable reality. I had reclaimed my stolen property, my financial independence, and my entire future. I did not stop at simply reclaiming my house. The intense forensic investigation that sent my toxic family to federal prison was just the beginning of my brand new life. 3 months ago, I sat in a quiet, sterile testing center and officially passed the final grueling section of my certified public accountant exams. When I saw the passing score illuminate on the computer screen, I broke down and cried heavy tears of pure, unfiltered joy. I had spent years studying in the dark, running on zero sleep, and cheap ramen noodles, constantly told by my family that I was a mediocre, invisible disappointment. But that official piece of paper proved to the entire world and to myself that I was brilliant, capable, and completely unstoppable. With Grandpa Richard providing the initial capital backing and his absolute unwavering belief in my professional abilities, I opened my own independent forensic accounting firm right in the heart of downtown Seattle. I did not want to just work for faceless corporate clients analyzing standard tax returns. I dedicated a massive branch of my new firm entirely to helping victims of familial financial abuse. I now spend my days tracking down hidden assets, exposing financial predators, and handing power back to the vulnerable people who have been silenced and robbed by their own blood relatives. I take the severe trauma my parents inflicted upon me, and I use it as an unbreakable shield to protect others who are fighting the exact same nightmare. This morning, I woke up early as the warm golden sun was just beginning to rise over the Oakwood Hills estate. I walked out onto the expansive stone patio carrying a warm ceramic mug of dark, rich coffee. The morning air was crisp, clean, and incredibly peaceful. I sat in a comfortable plush lounge chair and looked out over the perfectly manicured lawns and the tall, ancient oak trees surrounding my secure property. I took a deep, slow breath, filling my lungs with completely free and untainted air. I do not just live in a beautiful, expensive house. I live in a fortress of my own making. My parents tried to completely bury me. They tried to lock me in a psychiatric cage, steal my entire identity, and erase my voice from the world forever. But I did not just survive their incredible malice. I completely and utterly decimated their false reality. I tore down their fragile glass castle, and I built my own authentic, powerful empire on the absolute truth. For years, I was told that family is absolutely everything. Society constantly conditions us to believe that we must endlessly forgive, accommodate, and sacrifice for the people who share our DNA, even when they are the exact ones holding the knife to our backs. We are taught from a very young age that setting a boundary is a harsh betrayal and that protecting ourselves from toxic relatives makes us selfish, dramatic, or ungrateful. But I am here to tell you right now that blood does not give anyone the right to steal your future. Blood does not give anyone the right to abuse you, manipulate you, or tear down your mental health just to build up their own comfortable lives. Setting a firm absolute boundary is not a betrayal of your family. Sometimes it is the only possible way to survive their dysfunction. When the people who are supposed to unconditionally protect you try to bury you under their greed and their deceit, you do not just dig yourself out of the dirt. You find your inner strength, you gather your undeniable evidence, and you absolutely bury their lies. You expose the cold, hard truth to the light, and you refuse to carry the heavy, crushing weight of their sins for one more second. If you strongly believe that justice should always catch up to toxic family members, and that no one has the right to steal your peace, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now. Your incredible support helps bring these powerful stories of survival and justice to the people out there who desperately need to hear them today. I really want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me exactly where you are watching from and what time it is there. We are building a massive global community of strong survivors, and I absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from around the world. Have you ever had to permanently cut off a toxic relative to save your own sanity? Have you ever had to walk away from people who constantly tried to make you feel small and invisible? Let me know your personal story in the comments below, because your courage might be exactly what someone else needs to read today to find their own strength. Thank you so much for watching this journey, and remember, never let anyone silence your truth.